We are constantly exposed to wide arrays of sound in our environment. Outside a coffee shop, you may hear car traffic, conversation, bird calls, and a breeze in the trees. We can take advantage of differences in these soundscapes to quantify biodiversity of vocalizing animals or understand changes in human impact to ultimately infer animal community or ecosystem health. To investigate these patterns, however, requires extensive amounts of audio data and algorithms to classify sounds. Here, we gathered 500,000 minutes of audio data across Sonoma County over the past 4 years. This project's primary goal is to accurately classify human noises, called anthrophony, animal vocalizations, called biophony, environmental noises, called geophony, and what we call other, or electronic interference with recording devices. Within each of these categories are subcategories as well, such as car traffic, insects, or wind.
In this project, convolutional neural networks are how we interpret images. These models take abstract features like lines to form curves, then shapes, and eventually classify complex images. These features need to be learned through what is called a training process, and then are applied on a new image in a testing process. Large and complex models require millions of labeled images to have a model develop the intuition behind what pixels make up any given object.
We identified over 7,000 instances of anthrophony, biophony, or geophony to be used as training data in our models. These regions of interest were clipped to 2-second segments and converted into MEL spectrograms, which are visualizations of the audio data showing frequency along the y-axis, time along the x-axis, and sound intensity as the color. Before we can start classifying our data, we need to make sure no biases exist within a given dataset of MEL spectrograms. One of our biggest concerns was that of sample size. As for each class, there are large discrepancies in data representation. This may bias our classifiers. So to account for this overrepresentation, we inflate minority classes with randomly oversampled data to be overrepresented copies of themselves within their own class.
To build our own model, we would need significantly more labeled data if we were going to construct a fully fledged convolutional neural network of our own. This led us to rely on a technique known as transfer learning. Transfer learning allows us to take a model that has been previously trained on millions of images and repurpose that model's architecture for our own data classification needs. In our initial testing, we followed this workflow by adding and removing various layers from the convolutional neural network architectures that we were testing. We were able to very quickly build a model that was able to classify the provided MEL spectrograms. However, unfortunately, our additional layers that we added and removed for the purpose of classification weren't able to be trained efficiently enough and resulted in a classification accuracy of around 76%. This encouraged us to implement other machine learning techniques for better synthesizing our model's feature recognition capabilities. Our future data would instead be trained on the activations of perceptrons inside the model itself. At this point, we still didn't know the best place to extract features from. By testing shallow and deeper layers, we saw how the convolutional neural network progressively improved as more layers were added, and also were able to note when improvements were tapering off. With an optimal layer selected, we were then able to further utilize these activated perceptrons in the following steps.
In extracting activation layers from convolutional neural networks, we ask ourselves whether all the features are helpful to our SVM's classifier's training. This matters because if the number of features per data point increases, the harder it becomes to visualize our data. If the data was 1 or 2 dimensional, we could easily plot our data in a number line or Cartesian graph. 3-dimensional data is still able to be graphed. However, our nth dimensional data can't easily be interpreted in an effective manner. This is the motivation for using UMAP as a dimensionality reduction technique. UMAP attempts to capture local and global characteristics in our high-dimensional data and project them onto a smaller feature space. Here is an example of our data being projected onto a 2D feature space. Here, Anthrophony, biophony, geophony, and other are colored as blue, orange, green, and pink. UMAP learned to group our training data and applied what it learned to transform our test data onto the same feature space. UMAP is not 100% accurate, and you may see areas where the test data does not map near a cluster or appear in an incorrect cluster class. Our results of training and classifier with UMAP's features demonstrate an average accuracy of 85%.
With our features extracted from our CNN and interpreted by UMAP, our support vector machine is now ready to do the final classification of our results. SVMs normally only classify 2 classes, but because our data consists of 4 classes, we needed to use an error-correcting output codes classifier with an SVM parameter template. We used 3 main SVM templates, each with a different kernel. One was linear, one was polynomial, and one was RBF, radial basis function. During the training of each model, we used Bayesian optimization for finding the optimal hyperparameters. Several features extracted from a CNN called MobileNet v2 performed well with classification accuracies near 85%. We decided to combine these features by concatenating them before training our SVM model and to see if they improved the classification rate. We saw a bump up to 87%, but this wasn't significant enough for us to continue down this route.
While 4 sound categories are useful, we gain more insight into a soundscape when using smaller subcategories within our existing 4 categories. Anthro is split up into smaller human sounds, such as voice, music, sirens, and more. The same goes for geo, bio, and other. So after we classify our original data, we can then pass each classification to a subcategory classifier to classify the result with a more useful label. If we are concerned specifically about the classifications, then after applying a filter measuring for high confidence intervals, we get subcategory accuracy rates of 96%, 86%, 89%, and 100% for each category listed. This does, however, come at the cost of reducing the images we classify to only 30 to 40% of our original testing set. Note that these measurements are not in isolation, and that any 2-second recording of a sound is but a sample of a much larger dataset at play. And when performing heuristics on our massive library of sounds, we'll be able to accurately identify the long-term changes in an environment's soundscape. CNN classification of each category allows us to gain insight into spatial and temporal patterns of sound activity. We can now classify 500,000 minutes of sound data and understand broad landscape scale patterns of biodiversity, human impact through noise pollution, and areas of quiet. Thank you for watching.